A little bit about, thank you, Rebecca. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up outside Cleveland, Ohio, in a house filled with books and reading material. I have always been a reader and writer. As Rebecca said, I majored in English. I worked as an English teacher and taught several other things along the way. And I also worked as a freelance writer for newspapers and magazines. And the older I get, the more convinced I am that we are story creatures. We're hardwired for stories. There's something in our DNA. We want to listen to stories. We want to tell and share our stories. And I'm sure everybody here can remember a favorite story, maybe a fairy tale, maybe a chapter book they had as a kid. You probably participated in family get-togethers where Uncle Charlie or Aunt Sally would tell a family story after a couple of drinks. You probably have a favorite book, maybe a favorite movie. We are story people. And after I retired, I heard a story at a family get-together in South Georgia, down in Lumpkin, which is a little town about 40 miles north of Albany. And now, everyone cross your fingers and hold your breath because I'm going to try and do a screen share. Okay, we did it. Can you all see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I need to make this a little bigger.
Okay, well, this is
Okay.
the word
We went to a family get-together in Lumpkin, an annual Labor Day barbecue. There were people from all over the county. Helen's cousins started cooking chicken and ribs at 6 o'clock in the morning. Everybody brought a covered dish, and we just sat and ate all day. And while we were at this barbecue, I heard a story that really resonated with me. It was a story I heard from one of Helen's elderly relatives. And it was a story about a couple who had lived in Lumpkin in the 20s and 30s. They had both been previously married. They were widowed, and they married, and together, lo and behold, they had a little boy. She was in her mid-40s. He was in his late 50s. But this little boy was born a mongoloid. This was before the term Downs was used. And he didn't go to school. There were no special ed classes. He stayed at home with the family just about every day working on the farm. And he grew to become a big boy, but his mother always said he was gentle as a flea. He wouldn't hurt a soul. Well, his older half-brother was very abusive. He called him dummy, dimwit, moron, and he made him do most of the physical work on the farm. As their father got more feeble, the abuse accelerated. And when the father died, things blew up. There was a fatal shooting. And I won't tell you what or how the shooting occurred, but that story, along with the experience I had working with a little boy with Downs, became the seed for Crooked Truth. The little boy I was working with was very different from Robert, the boy in the story. He went to public school, he was in special ed, and he had a very supportive family. He was well liked, no one bullied him, or called him names, but he was very limited. He couldn't tie his shoes, he could barely print his name, and he was hard to understand. But that experience made this story about Robert even more poignant to me. And I decided after I retired, I was going to write a book. I had a storyline. I had a locale or a setting, a fictitious community called Crisscross, which was located in South Georgia, 1948, on a farm in the middle of cotton country. But what I needed was a narrator. I wanted to tell the story in first person, and Robert could not tell the story. So I created a character, a 15-year-old boy named Lucas. And Lucas comes to live on the farm when he's about 3 years old. His parents are killed in a car wreck, and Granny is his maternal grandmother. So he comes to live on the farm, and as he gets older, becomes the reluctant caretaker for Robert, his older uncle with Down syndrome, or the Mongoloid. And Robert follows Lucas around like a sticky shadow. He can't even go in the bathroom without Robert hanging over his shoulder. Well, I worked on the story for several years. I did lots and lots of revising. I killed lots and lots of trees. I made some major changes. I changed the title of the story. I changed some of the main characters' names. I had 2 endings before I finally found the ending that felt right for the characters. I had a completed manuscript, and I was ready for the next step, which, if you're going to work with a traditional publisher, you need to have an agent. So I started sending out queries, trying to find someone to represent Crooked Truth. Some people said, send me the first couple chapters. A few people said, send me the first 10 chapters. But nobody said, send me your manuscript. I have got to have this manuscript. I know I can sell it. And I was getting pretty discouraged after investing all this time and energy on Crooked Truth. Then I heard about Mercer Press. Mercer is a small college about an hour and a half south of Atlanta in Macon, and they have a university press. They publish 2 catalogs a year. They do fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and some academic material. And they had an award for the short story or novel that best exemplified the human experience in a Southern context. So I bundled up my manuscript. This is 3 days before the deadline. Rushed over to FedEx at 11:45, and at 11:55, the manuscript was on its way to Macon. And I started lighting candles, offering prayers, hoping Crooked Truth would receive the award. Well, lo and behold, I get a call 6 months later. Crooked Truth won the Farrell Sams Fiction Award. And here's a photo of Farrell Sams. He did his undergrad work at Mercer, and then he went on to become a doctor, and he wrote several books about his experience growing up in a small town in Georgia, and they were published by Mercer. But I won the award for the best manuscript, and even more importantly, I got a contract, the coveted contract. And I thought, wow, my book is going to be out by Christmas. I can put it under the tree. Well, wrong. The book, because I was an unknown author, went into the queue. It was another 2 years before the book finally came out. The book came out in fall of 2020, and it's available through Mercer, through Amazon, through some small bookstores if you request it, and the Wittenberg Library has a couple of copies. So it was a long journey filled with many stops and starts, some dead ends, some U-turns, but the book is complete. I had some helpful resources along the way. And some of you may be familiar with Anne Lamont's Bird by Bird. One of the most helpful things she says in her book, and it's just a slim little volume, is first drafts are always shitty. And I took great comfort in that sentence because I had a lot of drafts. Another helpful book was Stephen King's On Writing. And Stephen King says, the muse is not some ethereal being that comes down to sit on your shoulder and whisper inspiration in your ear. The muse is the grungy guy who lives in the basement and you have to dig him out. So those were 2 bits of information and advice I've held on to. I also read the Writer's Digest magazine, and it's a great place to find information about agents and contests. I go to writing conferences and workshops. I'm part of a critique group, and they give lots of helpful feedback and encouragement. If you'd like more information about my background or upcoming events, please go to my website. There's lots of info on the website. And now my husband, who is a long-time Atlantan, one of the few natives, Atlanta's population has become more and more transient, but he and his family have been here for several generations. He's going to read a selection from chapter 2, and this is a scene where you'll meet all the major characters on a Saturday night, and they are in the parlor, the old family parlor, and Robert is singing. And while he's singing, Alvin Earl, the older half-brother, comes in. So here's Hewlin, my husband and longtime critic.
Hello to everybody. I'm very lucky here to be able to read just a short passage from Kristine's book. I am a Georgia boy. You can probably tell from my accent. I remember the days when, back in the day, my dad was a bus driver, and I remember the days when the African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. I remember going shopping to downtown Atlanta, and you had the old water fountains that were colored white only. I remember all the stuff that was going on back during the time of this book and right after the book. So without further ado, I'll just read a page or two of the book just to give you a feel for Kristine's great ability to verbalize what's going on in the South. As we sang, I heard Alvin Earl come in the back door and poke around the kitchen, searching for some leftover supper. When he couldn't find anything to eat, he came into the parlor and leaned against the wall. He wore a starched white shirt, and his shoes had more polish on them than Granny's piano. He'd slicked back his hair to hide his bald spot, and I could smell the vitalis from across the room. A little dab of toilet paper clung to his chin, soaking up the blood from a shaving nick, and he had a cigarette stuck behind his ear. Granny droned on, and I heard a deep voice on the radio announcing tonight's episode. Fixing my eyes on the mantel clock, I slowly inched toward the kitchen, eager to make my escape. Robert, enjoying an audience, started another round of Clementine and swayed to the music. He had a high, sweet voice, but little bubbles of spit popped up on his lip when he sang, and he always got the words mixed up. After he finished the last line, Alvin Earl clapped and asked, "You can train a monkey or a dog to do tricks. Which one is he?" Granny jerked her pale fingers off the keys and froze. Alvin Earl's question hung in the air like a bad note, and silence filled the room. When no one answered, he asked again, "Is he a trained monkey or a circus dog doing tricks?" Glancing at Robert, I knew he didn't catch the sarcasm in Alvin Earl's voice or even understand the question. He thought it was funny and laughed. "I'm not a monkey. I'm not a dog. I'm your brother." I don't get a word he's saying. He talks like he's got a mouthful of grits. Pulling out his lighter with the one-eyed Jack insignia, he flipped the top open. Then he spun a little rubber wheel around with his thumb. Robert stared at the silver lighter, and Granny frowned. If you spend some time with Robert, you wouldn't have any problem understanding him. We never have any problem understanding him, do we, Harold? Pawpaw, looking old and tired, stirred in his chair and opened his eyes. He scowled at Orville Owl. None at all. Then Granny turned toward Robert and smiled. "Alvin Earl knows you're his brother, and he's just joking with you." "Yeah, you want to go for a ride in my new truck, boy?" Alvin Earl said with a sneer. "We could go into Crisscross and play some cards. I'm feeling really lucky tonight." Robert reached into his pocket and held up a shiny penny little George had given him a couple of years ago. "I got a lucky piece." "That's enough." Pawpaw threw down his newspaper. "Let's hear you boys sing again."
Thank you, Hewlin. Thank you. I think we're ready for the Q&A.
Hi, Kristine. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn this light on so that they can see us a little bit better as well. Right?
Thank you, Andrew.
That was beautiful. Thanks so much again, and thanks for writing this book. You know, I got to read it about a month ago, and I absolutely loved it. It reminded me immediately of This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger, and also The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles, and the Girls in the Stilt House by Kelly Mustian. And all of those books were set in the South. They were dusty. They were involved in the landscape. And I just thought that yours was a perfect fit. So just by way of a first question, I was wondering what authors, what stories inspired your own? I mean, you talked about the ways that they came out of real life, but are there writers that you admired and were inspired by for this project?
Oh, so many. And some playwrights as well. Tennessee Williams, Steinbeck, and I've been reading Kristen Hanna's book, Four Winds. It's interesting to compare that with Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I'm starting Lincoln Highway. I like Stephen King, and I think he's often, his talents are often underestimated. Robert Cormier, who has written a lot of middle school fiction. It's a long list. I try to read a variety of things from a variety of different authors. But I read differently now than I used to read because I'm a slower reader. I'm a more deliberate reader. I don't skim as much. I'm always interested in how authors develop their characters and their setting, how they use dialogue, how they pace their story.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to ask you about all of that today. Again, just thanks for coming. Thanks for returning, spending time with us at Wittenberg. And thanks again for writing this awesome book. So I would just open it up to any questions. Anyone in the room, how many people have read this book so far? I have. Has anyone else? Okay, there's one other, so we'll have to be careful of like spoiler alert. But if you have any questions for Kristine about the audience at all, please do that. So I have a couple to start us off. And my first one has to do with the landscape. You mentioned how you set this story in the center of cotton country. And the landscape felt really central to this book. It was dusty, there were farm fields, there was heat, and I felt very immersed in the space. So I was wondering about the fictional town of Crisscross and how the landscape worked its way into the story, what it meant to you, and also what it meant to write about a fictional town. You know, if you've gotten any feedback about that, are there any advantages to writing about a fictional space?
I think I appreciated and recognized the importance of the space and the setting as well as the time period more in writing this story because early on, someone who critiqued the manuscript suggested treating the setting like a character. And I didn't really understand what she meant. But then as I started reading more Southern literature, I could see how real the setting becomes and how much it influences characters' daily activities, major events. You know, think about Gone with the Wind. Can you imagine reading Gone with the Wind if it were set in Detroit in the 1860s or even Washington, D.C.? You know, the setting is so key in Gone with the Wind, like To Kill a Mockingbird. You couldn't transport those books to another locale and still have the same characters and plot development.
Yeah. Yeah, even the weather in Crooked Truth seems so central. Like it got really hot at the right sort of moments, you know?
It's ungodly hot in South Georgia because most of South Georgia is what we call below the gnat line. And in July and August, September, the gnats are vicious. People who live there don't seem to notice it so much, but you're constantly trying to get the gnats out of your nose, out of your ears. They're all over.
Yeah, I'm from northern Wisconsin, so we're above the mosquito line, you know? The cold is awful and the mosquitoes are awful. So I can empathize. But yeah, man, that heat, the kitchens that we were allowed to go into and cook in, and the barns, the landscape played such a central role. I'm wondering, have you read the book in Georgia, and have you gotten reactions to using a fictional town called crisscross. Why did you choose a fictional town instead of choosing a real small town?
Well, the real small town where Hewlin's cousin lives, Lumpkin in Stewart County, is a dying community. It is the county seat, but the county square is pretty much deserted, and people are going to another nearby town for grocery stores, drug stores, doctor's appointments. The biggest industry in Lumpkin is now actually a detainee center that's operated by a company that manages detainee facilities. So Crisscross was kind of a combination of several small towns where cotton was key.
So you feel that, did it create more opportunities then? I can grab a little bit of this town, a little bit of that
Yes.
town.
Yes, and the title, I think I mentioned, I changed the title of the book. The original title was By Hands Unknown, but when I changed the ending, I felt I needed to make a change in the title. So Crisscross ties in with that idea of crooked truth.
Yeah.
That's why I chose the name Crisscross, and also the fact that Lumpkin actually does have several railways that do intersect.
Yeah. All right. Wonderful. I found personally that writing about a fictional town offered some freedom, you know, to use a bit more hyperbole, to use a bit more exaggeration. But I have at times heard back from people who just would really rather have a real space. You know, they'll claim there is no waterfall that high in Mississippi, you know? And I just kind of cling to Faulkner and say, well, I just wanted to make stuff up, right? So I'm curious too about the time period. And I'll ask this question. And then Rebecca, I wanted to mention too, I can see there are 4 comments in the chat, but I only have 2 on mine. I'm not able to see all of them. So if I miss any, please interrupt me, right? Thanks.
You're good so far.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, Kristine, about the time period as well. You know, I like the book, This Tender Land and Lincoln Highway. They're all sort of these rich mid-century American adventures. Were there any advantages in writing about a time that's now removed? What did it mean to write in that period of history? What did it mean to write a story that didn't take place in the modern day?
I wanted to use that time period, Andrew, because there was a character in the story. It was actually Little George's and Corinthia's son, who had been served time in Italy. He was a soldier, but he disappeared. He was missing in action. And there's a strong racial theme that runs through the story. And at one point, Little George comments to Lucas, he and both Corinthia are grieving for their son because there was never anybody. There was just a notice, your son is missing in action. And Little George makes a comment, I'm glad he didn't come home and see that things are just the way they were before he left. Even though Truman had passed, I think it was a mandate saying that segregation should be outlawed in the military. There was still, we were in the Jim Crow era.
Yeah.
And there were still a lot of limitations. Very few African Americans used the GI Bill. Neighborhoods were being redlined. There was still a lot of blatant discrimination.
That comes through very strongly in the book, and the critique of discrimination comes through very strongly in the book, particularly through the character of that awful uncle who is very unlikable and also very racist. You know, he kind of is the epitome of that in that story. And this question, I wanted to ask you about Southern culture too, and not just Southern landscape, but Nate Dreyfus, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, asked the question for us in the chat. He said, the prize you won was specifically for Southern fiction. What does that characterization mean to you? Certainly the landscape, the heat, the gnats. But what else does that characterization of Southern fiction mean? And what did it mean for you to win that award?
Let me clarify the question, Nate. Are you asking in terms of what does it mean to me in terms of my writing career, or?
As an influence and as a characterization, really. What is it that makes Southern fiction? And how do you see crooked truth in that tradition, such as it is?
Okay. Southern fiction, I think, is fiction with a strong sense of place, a strong setting, a strong sense of family and community, a strong sense of traditions, and those can be both bad and good. Oftentimes a strong sense of religion or spirituality, maybe even some voodoo or Gothic elements. But Atlanta is a strange place in many ways, because in some ways Atlanta is a very fast-paced, sophisticated city, but in other ways it's still a good old boy network and still very segregated, even though we have many, many Black officials in our government and Atlanta City School Board.
So
On Sunday morning,
sorry, go ahead.
On Sunday morning, the city is very segregated.
So could Southern fiction be written set in Atlanta? Could it be written after the Civil Rights era? Or is it almost definitionally rural and
My follow-up book is actually set in the early 60s against the backdrop of the civil rights movement. And two of the characters, Cotton, who is African American, he worked on the farm. He's Little George and Corinthia's nephew. He has headed north and become a professional baseball player for a Cleveland team, a fictitious team. And he and Lucas hook up when Corinthia comes to him, Lucas, one night and knocks on his door and tells him that Cotton has disappeared. Lucas is still in Atlanta, but Cotton is assigned with his professional team in Cleveland. But he's also gotten involved with the civil rights.
I'm looking forward to that one. That's your follow-up book, you said?
That's my follow-up book, sitting on my desk right now.
Oh, awesome. Please email me when that's going to come out, because I'd love to read that one too. Hopefully we can do this again. Rebecca, yeah? Thumbs up? Right on. Very good. Well, I just wanted to pause to make sure. Were there any questions from the live audience? Does anyone want to ask a question at this point? Yes.
I have a question. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. So Andrew touched on briefly the historical setting, and so that made me curious. Did you find yourself needing to do any historical research or reading books about the time, or did you already kind of have an awareness of the historical context?
I am always doing research. Sometimes I think I do too much research, and I am always asking questions. And I think that's where the journalistic experience helped, because as a journalist, you learn how to ask questions. So I'm always asking questions, always listening, always watching, to the point where we would go into a restaurant and my kids would say, "Don't stare, Mom. It's rude to stare."
Were there any particular nonfiction books that helped you with that historical research?
The Parting of the Waters by Taylor Branch, which is a massive book, a 3-volume series, and John Lewis's Carrying the Wind, which was actually ghostwritten and came out in 1992.
Wonderful. Your story about staring at people in restaurants on the heels of the discussion of Southern writing reminds me of Flannery O'Connor, and how she wrote, there's a quality of fiction writers they can't do without, and that is the ability to just stare at things. Yeah, and so I love that you brought that up. So here's another question up from the chat. This is from John Anderson, and this has to do with characters and the inspiration for them. Now, you definitely talked about the inspiration for Robert and the inspiration for the uncle. This one asks about Lucas. Did you consider the traits of any of your high school students when you were developing your main characters, such as Lucas? And then I would add Amelia.
I think for Lucas, I considered more the traits of my boys. I have 2 boys, and they're very competitive, but one is more outgoing than the other. And Amelia, there was actually a Jewish family that lived in Lumpkin. They operated the movie theater. They were the only Jewish family in the community. So she was partly based on a family from Lumpkin. But I wanted to use someone from another faith to show that the prejudice was not just racial.
Amelia was such a wonderful character. She really came in like a breath of fresh air amidst all that heat. She was so different from the community. She was one of the few characters who seemed able to accept Robert, the uncle, and she was just wonderful, like a wonderful contrast. So, without spoiling things, I'm glad she came in, and I'm glad where that character took you. Yeah, that was great.
I think that was why Lucas was attracted to her, the fact that she was so different.
She was, and yet, like, what did you? Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh, go ahead. I see your hands raised, but it just says iPad as your name. Oh, muted still here. I got you asked to unmute.
There we go. There. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I have a question now, not so much about the background of the book, but the publishing. What other publishing options would you have had to pursue if you hadn't won the Mercer Award?
Good question. I probably would have continued to query, and if I hadn't gotten an agent to represent me, I probably would have looked at some of the smaller presses. Maybe University of Georgia is not a small press, but it's a very visible press, and maybe considered what we call a hybrid route to publishing, and that's something fairly new. It's kind of a variation on self-publishing where you work with a company who offers you different services. They can do editing for you. They will do layout, printing, formatting. They will do marketing, distribution, publicity. And you as the author have the option of choosing these services. It's kind of an a la carte deal. And that seems to be becoming more and more common in the publishing world. And then the other thing that is fairly new, can you get that, Christie's book, is crowdsourcing. And I know of several people, including our daughter, who's written a bilingual picture book, who are trying to raise money for the book before they actually do the printing. Our daughter wrote a children's picture book and she crowdsourced it. She thought if she could get 250 orders for the book, she would go ahead and print it, get it printed. And she didn't make any great sum on the book, but at least she got her foot in the proverbial door. And there's another writer with Atlanta connections, Charles Mcnair. He writes both fiction and nonfiction for adults, and he crowdsourced a book where he approached people in the writing community and asked them if they would advance order his book. So I don't see myself crowdsourcing, but I think in terms of publishing options, there's more options out there now than ever before. I know somebody else in a small community north of Georgia, and he writes mostly science fiction. He has actually started his own publishing company. So if you want to see your material in print, there are options. But you got to do your homework. And you probably have to spend some of your own money. Hewlin has a friend, he's a retired professor, and he published a science fiction fantasy. He went with a company in New York, and he only sold 12 or 13 copies, but he did not get the marketing package, and he is not the kind of guy who's going to go out there and try and promote his book. If he had purchased their marketing package, I think he would have had more sales. But you can actually hire people who will do publicity for you, will help you with your marketing.
That's wonderful. Are there any other questions in the chat or from the room about the book, about the publishing process? I have a few more about writing, since I have a writer in the room. I got to ask you about writing, but are there any other questions here?
I'm wondering from the group, how many people have a manuscript or a memoir tucked in a drawer and they're just waiting for the time and opportunity to work on it and try and get it published, even if it's just for family and friends? Anybody in the creative writing class?
Got one. Anthony? Ron? I have manuscripts in my sock drawer. Yeah. Good. Yeah, so we've got two in the room. Yeah, definitely. And it looks like at least one online. Yeah.
So there are options out there. Memoirs are hot. Memoirs and cookbooks.
What encouragement would you have though to sort of to bear the dark night of the soul, so to speak, that every writer goes through? Because it's tempting to just see your words in print as quickly as possible and say self-publish. But what encouragement would you have to also like wait it out? You know, keep querying agents, because that can take months and even years to get people to
Right.
read. Right? So, yeah, what would your recommendation be to those of us with manuscripts and ideas, and we're working on something, and it's, you know, we're weathering all the doubts that come with that?
I would hang in there unless you're trying to feed your family and pay your rent. Someone approached me about kind of a hybrid deal with self-publishing, and I asked, had a writing coach with Crooked Truth. I asked her, and she advised me against it, saying that sometimes when you self-publish, it makes it harder for you to go with a traditional publisher.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, I submitted the manuscript to Mercer, and I think it was a much stronger, better developed manuscript than it was 2 years before.
Yeah, yeah. That's great. Stacy Abella writes, I'm working on a manuscript now. Hope to be finished this summer. I say, keep going, Stacy. Me too. I hope to be finished as well. What's the writing? What does writing feel like to you, Kristine? I just described it as a dark night of the soul sometimes. But what was that process like too? Certainly highs and lows, but how do you experience the craft process?
It can be extremely frustrating. And I tell the people in my writing group, if this were easy, everybody would be doing it. It ain't easy. And it's not fun to put your butt in the chair every day for several hours and some days just kind of eke out a couple of paragraphs. It's not an easy process. And we have a kind of a grouping of writers. People are often described as either pantsers, people who literally write off the seat of their pants. They're more organic, more spontaneous, or people who are outliners, people who have a more detailed plan or approach. I think I am in another category. I'm oftentimes in the hope and the grope category.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is often really hard, and it does feel like difficulty. Marilyn Robinson once said to a group of writers, what you're doing is a difficult thing. Expect to experience it as difficulty. And I love that. It makes so much sense. It's like trying to get in shape or go running. I'm not a runner. I try to run. It's hard. Why am I surprised that it's hard, right? I shouldn't.
Yes.
Same thing with art.
And it's a solitary effort. You can have a writing group, you may have a writing buddy, but it's not like having somebody to run along with you and train with you.
Yeah.
A lot of it is solitary work.
You mentioned Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird, and I'm thinking of her. I think of that book. I love that book. I think it's one of the best books on writing out there. And she describes the inner life of the writer, all the doubt and the anxiety, and some really hilarious passages about sending a manuscript off to an editor and then waiting, and already the next day like hating that editor for not responding soon enough. And were there other spaces in that book, Bird by Bird, that you found particularly encouraging or helpful?
I think I found her personal story very encouraging because she's a recovering alcoholic, and yet she's been a very successful writer. And I think her Bird by Bird and other books are very honest and very transparent. And as a reader writer, I appreciate that honesty and willingness to kind of show her flaws and weaknesses.
Mm. Yeah. Speaking of, that's a perfect segue to Nate's next question, I think, Nate. Flaws and weaknesses. Nate writes this. I'm going to read it in its entirety so I don't miss it. I agree with your opening statement, and this is in the chat. We clearly are storytelling species. One could say an individual is nothing but a collection of the stories we tell about ourselves. An interesting corollary is that nobody thinks of themselves as the villain in their own story. To that point, I'm wondering whether you found it easier to write the characters who act nobly from their own perspective and nobly in the reader's frame of reference. Was it more difficult to imagine the perspective of the Uncle Alvin Earl, to give him the mixture of entitlement and disappointment and addiction, to allow him to act with such cruelty?
Alvin Earl was fun to write. He brought a lot of energy into the stories, a lot of action, and he did have some redeeming qualities, so he wasn't all negative. Maybe the redeeming qualities aren't as obvious, but I think early in the book, Papa says to him something to the effect, your mother never let you play with any of the colored kids. She was afraid you would get some kind of a disease. You spent most of your time in town. And then when he comes home drunk one night, literally crawling on his knees, barfing all over the front porch, and Granny asks Lucas to come help her bring him in the house. Alvin Earl calls out to his former wife, and Lucas says, she left you. Who's going to stay with you? And Alvin Earl says something to the effect, that was the biggest mistake I ever made. So I don't know if that really answered your question. Lucas in some ways was hard to write because he didn't have much agency initially. And part of his character arc was becoming more of his own agent, learning to speak out. And that's one reason I included Cotton in the story. Cotton was kind of a foil for Lucas, and when Cotton heads north and little George says, a colored man can't go up against a white man, Lucas realizes if anybody is going to try and deal with Alvin Earl, it's going to be him. He realizes he no longer has a choice. He can't just let things go on as they are.
Yeah, that came through very, very, very clearly. The shift in Lucas's agency, his growth, right? He sort of becomes, I mean, he begins as his brother's keeper, so to speak, right? But he ends sort of accepting that role, taking that in, and that was
Right.
That was very redeeming to see. You know, it was noble. Nate, would you like to follow up on your question if you need to? Feel free to unmute and ask if you'd like.
Oh, I have no problem unmuting myself and taking the mic. But in this case, I'm good. I thought that was a fine answer.
Let me ask the group something. Were there any scenes in the book you found particularly disturbing or upsetting to read?
Dogs.
Yes.
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 Yeah.
I have. What were they? Yeah, go ahead.
Can we zoom in on the kids in the library, Rebecca? Is there a way to zoom in?
We can't really zoom in. If anybody wants to walk closer to the camera, that feel free, but we can
Thank
zoom
you.
in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liza.
Oh, that's better.
Right.
Not that you're on the spot.
So I see that, I'm sorry to call you iPad, but I saw the iPad on you.
Me? I don't know how
Yes.
to, I don't know how to change it, but anyway, yeah, the puppy scene was just, that was really hard. I don't want to give away too much, but you know, that was like, my thought was, how did you come up with something so awful?
And I know that was especially hard for Kelly because Kelly's husband is a
That's
vet.
me.
Yes. And she always has animals in and out of her house.
Well,
I actually heard a story about a child who was given a bag of puppies and a quarter, and he was charged with disposing of the puppies.
yeah.
He didn't take the money, but he was forced to take the bag.
So I had a question for you, unless you wanted to follow up on those disturbing scenes.
There's someone in the back.
Yes.
Their hand up.
I haven't read the book, but I have a question. So I'm writing my own story, like my own life story, and I've been writing it since the 8th grade. I had an English teacher that like helped me out for a while and stuff. So she was my motivation to really get into like writing. But how do you find the motivation to like go up to the computer or whatever you did to write and keep writing instead of like how did you get past writer's block? Or moments and times where you were just like, okay, I don't want to touch this book right now, but I have to touch this book and finish up this book. So what got you through those points of writer's block?
Good question. And what I heard you saying was, how do you deal with writer's block?
Yes.
And I went to a writer's talk just within the past month, and the writer was saying there are several questions you need to ask yourself if you have a block or you've painted yourself in a corner. And one of those questions is, what if? What if such and such happened? Or look back at some of your previous characters and events. Is there some way you can expand or develop one of those events? But some days writing is easier than others. And some days I think you're more productive than others. Some days I barely get a couple of lines out, and other days I can just about crank out a chapter.
I read once that Joseph Conrad of Heart of Darkness reportedly used to sit down and cry before writing because it was so hard and he just didn't want to. And I was like, amen. If Joseph Conrad sits down and cries, that's encouraging to me. I don't know if it should be, but there's like, you know, comfort in that. It's sort of a, yeah.
And who was it, Andrew, who said writing is easy? I just sit down in front of the typewriter and prick a vein and let everything flow out.
I don't know. Who said that?
Have you heard that?
No.
I've heard that.
It might have been Hemingway.
Okay. Anne Lamott in Bird by Bird has a really funny story about that. She says she knows nobody who sits down and just writes a perfect first draft. And then she says, okay, well, we know one person that sits down and writes a good first draft, but none of us like her, And we're pretty sure God doesn't like reading. Yeah, yeah. I wanted to follow up on your question about hard scenes or scenes that are disturbing, right? Because you do write about some serious subject matter, but I think my own take is that your treatment of the subject matter, the spirit of it was redemptive, so to speak. Like I didn't
I'm
feel
sorry, was what, Andrew?
redemptive.
Okay.
I never felt that the descriptions were gratuitous. I never felt traumatized. I didn't feel like you were enjoying dragging me through hardship. I trusted the book, you know? And I'm really interested in, and this is the question for you, what are the moral or ethical implications of being an author? That is to say, I once heard Paul Harding of Tinkers say that if there is a moral implication, if we're doing our job well as writers, we're creating a world that is as livable as your 10th birthday party. We're going to immerse you in this experience. So, are there moral implications to what we dump you in, how we immerse our readers? I think there are. I think it varies, but I was just wondering if you could comment on that sort of territory, the ethical or moral implications of writing about hard things.
I think in many ways, writers provide witness. In telling stories, you're often witnessing, and if you witness, I think you often get into moral grounds. And when I first started the book, someone who read an early draft said to me, well, there's no redemption for Lucas. He is temporarily able to save Robert, but ultimately Robert ends up in the state institution and there's nothing he can do about it. Spoiler alert. There's kind of a terrible twist of fate for him. So I wanted to witness and let readers know sometimes things don't always come out the way we hope or pray. And I don't know if that's a reflection of morality or more a reflection of the day-to-day reality.
Yeah. No, that makes good sense. And I think that's one of the ways that storytelling, you said we're all story people. And
Right.
I often think that's one of the ways in which storytelling can serve as sort of a balm, frankly. In the same way, it's nice to know that Joseph Conrad also cried when he tried to write.
Mm-hmm.
It's also nice to not feel isolated, to read these other stories in that confessional sort of space and say, oh, I'm not the only human to have thought this or worried that or suffered this. Yeah. But again, I do want to reiterate, I like the way you did it. I like the spirit of it, you know? So,
I think individuals have stories, but I think communities, countries have stories. And the stories are one of the things that can bind a community together. And we've all heard about the concern and the disgust with what's going on in the Ukraine has bound the country together. How the pandemic has brought us together.
Yeah.
And neither one of those are very pretty, very appealing stories, but they're very real.
Right.
And at times inescapable.
And it'll probably take time for those stories to materialize, for people to make sense of them fully. You know, I've heard it takes a couple of decades for the war novels to come out about any given war. It just takes that long to sit, right? To make sense, to have some
Get some perspective.
Yeah.
And maybe that's one thing writers can offer their readers, a perspective.
That's great. That's really
And
good.
it may not be a perspective you agree with or like, but it's one person's perspective and interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, and reading books is like sort of this field trip through humanity then, right? It's a lower stakes place for me to come meet you and meet your heart and, you know, live a life I've never lived. I mean, Percy Shelley was all about flexing the empathy muscle, right? He said imagination,
Mm-hmm.
ability to imagine, to do what you're saying is our ability to sympathize. So, yeah,
And connect, sympathize
Right.
and connect. Yeah.
So, are there any other questions? We're kind of coming up towards the latter part of the show, and I want to respect Kristine's time and everyone else's. But are there any other questions that you'd like to ask Kristine before we?
We've got one. I think this is an awesome question. I too am curious, from Nate in the chat box.
Wonderful.
It's about extremely practical question. For our age of distraction, how do you write? Word processor, typewriter, longhand? Maybe this is an extremely millennial frame, but before writing, do you lock your phone in a safe or do you throw it in the lake?
I used to write longhand, but I have gotten to the point where I do everything, even my Christmas letter, on the computer. And I am not as disciplined about my phone as I should be. I know some writers put the phone in the other room, and I should probably do that. I try to write every day, preferably early in the morning or late at night. I try to get my butt in the chair. That's the big thing. And I do feel sometimes you can kind of get into a rhythm when you're having a good ebb. And when you get into the rhythm, I think the writing is easier and the story flows more. For me, I think the more I get to know my characters, the easier the writing becomes. Which is why with Crooked Truth, the first two endings did not feel right, but the third ending felt right because it felt like it was a reflection of the characters and where they were at the time.
Well, I sincerely hope that you remain in that rhythm, and we get to see the second book soon. I want to thank you again for your time. Thank you again for Crooked Truth. It was a really brilliant novel, and I enjoyed reading it, and I hope others pick it up as well. But I just wanted to thank you and turn it back over to you if there's any last things you'd like to tell us, and then turn it over to Rebecca to close us out. So thank you again for your time. It was great.
Thank you, Andrew. And I have a question for you. Do you
Sure.
see yourself as a pantser or an outliner or somewhere in between?
I'm working on becoming more of a pantser. That's my project in the second half of it. Yeah. Does that make perfect sense?
Unexpected.
Yeah. By the seat of my pants. Yeah. I think I started off like many, trying to control every aspect of a story or a book, but I've learned to accept surprises in writing and life, and I'm hoping I can learn to accept them even more. So it feels better on the nervous system that way.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you all. Any last other words, Kristine, that you want to say before we wrap it up?
If you want to write, put your butt in the chair and remember, if it were easy, everyone would be doing it. I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. Yeah.
You should. You should. Well, thank you so much, Kristine, and thank you for everyone who joined us and just made this such a great, lively conversation. We do book clubs like these and other Tiger Talks, you know, a couple times of a year. And so we're going to have another virtual event here around homecoming for sure. And so just stay tuned. You can always find our comprehensive list of alumni events and register at wittenberg.edu/events. And so I'm going to drop that in here, alumni events, in the chat for anybody who might need it. But otherwise, thank you all so much. I hope you have a great day. The recording will be available online. If there's anyone that you think, you know, could benefit from this conversation or would enjoy hearing Kristine and the reading and everything, feel free to go online and we'll send that out to your email also. So any last words from anyone before we hop off? All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, also for facilitating them in person. This was wonderful. You guys rock.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.